I'm very interested in the kind of esoteric side of the tradition that you were trained in, Shingon, right? That's the tradition?
That's correct.
Right. And you write about it having, so there's this idea of Vajrayana Buddhism, right, which usually is associated with Tibet, but you talk about this being a kind of a Japanese version of that. Could you say something about what these lineages like have in common compared to other types of Buddhism?
Sure, it's pretty straightforward. There's a sort of easy way to think of the whole Buddhist tradition seen from a bird's eye view. Because if you know the expression, you can't see the forest because of the trees, there's so much richness, complexity within Buddhism. Is there sort of a perhaps oversimplified but convenient way to think of the whole tradition? And I would say yes. Think of it as coming from India, being approximately 2,500 years old. That's very approximate. And in its native land of India, Buddhism went through 3 historical stages, very roughly speaking. An early period, about 500 years or so, very roughly, from the time of the Buddha till about, 400 or 500 years after that. There was a sort of early Buddhist practice. Then something developed that called itself the Great Vehicle, Mahayana. It arose out of that early practice. And by way of contrast, they called the earlier practice Hinayana, meaning small vehicle. Then out of Mahayana, after maybe 700 years or so of Mahayana developing, that evolved into something called Vajrayana, or the diamond vehicle. And that takes us to about the year 1200 AD, roughly. You have, about 500 years of this early practice, another 700 years or so, Mahayana is evolving, but the early practice is still there. Then Vajrayana evolves, and Mahayana and Hinayana, they're also still there. People practicing all 3 in the same monastery, for example, was not uncommon. Then what happened is that the Islamic forces completed their conquest of North India around the year 1200. That means that they penetrated the Gangetic Plain, northeast India. That was the heartland of Buddhism. And that if you read the Islamic accounts, they talk about, destroying the fortresses of the infidels. Well, those fortresses were monastic colleges. That's where people meditated and studied logic and things like that. And they that was those were government supported, meaning king, royal supported. The world's first universities actually were Buddhist universities in India. Because all 3 vehicles were centered in these universities, when those physical centers were destroyed, and then that combined with a resurgent Hinduism, that sort of was the end of Buddhism in India. Now, what happened is some of little things survived, but basically it was gone. And then now in the modern age, of course, it's been reintroduced. It's a product of India. It's been brought back. Well, where is it brought back from? Well, what happened was roughly the early practice went into Southeast Asia and is preserved as Theravada. So that would be Thailand, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and so forth. Then the Vajrayana, or the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle, that went into China about 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, and it evolved into many East Asian schools, the most important one, hands down, being Chan or Zen, which I'm sure most people have heard of. So Mahayana is essentially preserved in a modified form as a Chinese Chan, which is called Zen or Sun or Tien, depending on the part of East Asia. Then Vajrayana, as you mentioned, is very associated with Tibet and some other areas. Nepal, somewhat, Sikkim, Bhutan, Himalayan type areas. And Vajrayana is preserved there, a late form of Vajrayana, a very evolved form. And that's the dominant practice for the Tibetan Buddhist culture. Although the two other vehicles are very known and studied, most things are done within the Tantric or Vajrayana framework in Tibet. So that's a long introduction, but you can sort of get a picture. Early preserved in Southeast Asia, middle modified into Zen in East Asia, later stuff, well, it actually went everywhere. At one point, what we call Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism or esoteric Buddhism, various words are used, that was the fastest operating system. That was the, the supercomputer that was being advertised as the latest and greatest in the Buddhist world. So Vajrayana, which is essentially ritualized meditations combined with very fancy physical yogas, that spread from India throughout Buddhist Asia, but it's only been preserved significantly in two places. An early form went into China, died out, but was transmitted to Japan before it died out and is preserved in Japan as Shingon. So back in, 1970, when Westerners were getting interested in Vajrayana, they were all doing Tibetan things, but I do Japanese culture. So I wanted to specialize in this earlier form preserved in Japan. So basically you have early Vajrayana, which comes from India, preserved in Japan as Shingon, and also Tendai is another Japanese school that has that practice. And then you have the whole Vajrayana, actually the whole of Buddhism, preserved in Tibet, but they tend to emphasize the historically later, more developed practices with the physical yogas. Now, one last little culture note. If you go way off to the most eastern part of Indonesia, you come to the island of Bali. What's special about Bali? Bali is the part of Indonesia that never went Muslim. They still preserve a form of that Vajrayana practice. It's actually still done, and it's mixed with Malay shamanism, of course, but way out there, Bali High, we'll call you whatever, this sort of mystical island that actually exists. Part of it being so far east is you could still find a little remnant of Vajrayana, which was once everywhere in Buddhist Asia. So that's a long answer, I know, but now you know.